In the last year or so, I've been working on quite a few projects. I studied at the University of Reading on their Typography and Graphic Communications course, studying Letterform's history under James Moseley and Michael Harvey. And as a young boy, I was a voracious reader, and I loved reading stuff. And you know, as a child, when you grew up without the internet, your mother would drop you in a library and let you go crazy. And that was great, because I started to find little bits of writing that led to another bit of writing in another book. And I ended up with all this disparate information, but nowhere to string it together, because, you know, living in a developing country, you don't have anybody to help you. And then I won a scholarship, and I came to the UK and I was on this course with James Moseley, and he took all this disparate information, he strung it together in a seamless string. And so I run a lecture on the history of the alphabet, where I cover 2,500 years in 45 minutes, writing the scripts to show how they evolve, and that's in part due to James and Michael's influence. I then went on to study calligraphy, gilding, and heraldic painting at Reading, and my specialism was historical materials and techniques. So I fell in love with quills and started to understand why quills work the way they work. How did monks make manuscripts? And we still grind pigment in the studio. I taught Alice to make some shell gold, where we ground 2 books of double density, 24 karat gold, using an 8th century Indian miniature painting recipe, where you're grinding the gold in the honey with the side of your hand, and you get a fineness of material that you cannot buy, because of course you're spending 8 hours doing it yourself, which no fool in any factory will do. And so it's that kind of material culture that I was really fascinated with. But then I've always been fascinated with the lies that we're fed. Because I always found that one of the biggest problems with calligraphers, and I'm not a calligrapher, I'm a scribe, one of the biggest problems with calligraphers is they accept anything they're given. And they see something in a book and they repeat it. And so I've run into this problem of regurgitation. And sort of being an academic at heart, I ran into lots of issues, because I couldn't understand why people would say something and not actually go and do the research to back it up. And this stemmed from the use of the word copperplate. Now, calligraphers falsely believe that copperplate script was developed out of the engraver's burin, which is wrong, because the script came before the engraving. And 3 weeks ago, I had the amazing good fortune of being at the Newbury Library, and they managed to have a copy of Champion's original paste up for his writing master copybook, which made me leave the room because I was crying, because I couldn't believe how beautiful this was. Now I have some pictures on my phone, I have some pictures on my iPad, and I printed off some stuff, but there's no way you can see the kind of line work that was possible. And immediately I started to think, well, what did he use? And obviously, you know, there are different types of quills, but the principal type of quill that would have been used would have been a goose feather. Turkey feathers, not that common back then. Swan feathers, yes, but for very, very fine work, there are 2 things you have to consider. The length of the tine, because if the quill is cut and the tines are too long, there'll be too much flex. If the tines are quite short and stubby, you end up with some of those very hard, almost monoline signatures that we saw earlier on today. But if the tines are a medium length and or cut at an oblique angle, of course the obliqueness of the angle does vary depending on the script, you have quite a few options to play with. So I'll look at that there. But I'm going to start off by using some contemporary materials, because I always find it interesting to see this kind of thing done. To see this kind of thing done big. I try not to use document cameras when I work, because I find it gives a false perception of what's actually happening. When you see a big tool doing a big letter, you can equate you can make the shift in your mind to what a small tool doing the same size so scale letter would work as. And I found teaching with a document camera, if you demonstrate small and it's shown big, people trying to do it small don't have that perception. So one of the things I'm going to look at is some textual, some fracture, and how the fracture sort of flourishes. So we have a So with the introduction of the pointed flexible nib, and this is a great tool that was invented by a guy called Bill Hildebrand, who is no longer with us. It was designed to mimic what happens to the tines of a pointed flexible nib. And I'm sure you'll all recognize this kind of flourishing pattern. So flourishing is nowhere nearly as complicated as you think it is. It's all really a series of geometric constructions. In the last year, I'm preparing to publish a manual on the English round hand. So I'm trying to get people to sort of have a look at this script again, because this script is erroneously referred to as copperplate script. And historically, the English round hand has, to my mind, two parts. It has a proto-English round hand structure, which exists prior, from about 1604, when you have people like Lucas Matereau and Louis Bobador producing their writing master copybooks in France, and that ending up in England. And of course, you have this wonderful confluence of I don't need this just now. You have this wonderful confluence of stuff happening at around 1600, where you have this cancelleresque hand that the English nobility have. You have this influx of Dutch scripts coming into England because of English mercantile trade. You have remnant scripts, you know, the bastard secretaries and the bastard hands, and the cursive hands, and some of the business hands and the court hands and the set hands, and all these hands coming together. And then you have this mistake, which sort of happens when Matereau starts playing with cancelleresque corsiva. And instead of producing that club serif, instead of filling the ball, he accidentally leaves a loop. And from that loop, we see the development of the English round hand. Now, 1604 to about 1700, maybe a little bit later, about 1725. I haven't really looked at this history in that much detail. The nib starts to change from a small left oblique cut quill to a pointed flexible quill for a number of reasons, and one of the reasons is this little fella. So these wonderful fandangle inventions, these little quill cutters can quite easily cut a quill. Now, cutting a quill is not actually that difficult. But once you cut the edge off, clean the pith out, shove the thing in, depress the thing, you end up with a point. So from the point, what do you do? Well, you have a little penknife. And you can snip the end of the quill with the penknife to give you a little square edge. Whether or not you cut it straight across, or left oblique, or right oblique, as in some of the writing master copybooks, some of the German writing master copybooks like Fugger, he talks about different types of obliques for different scripts. So we know that there exists in the record the ability to cut quills at different angles. This penknife has not been sharpened since I purchased it, and it's sort of, early 18th century, and it's so sharp still. So I don't know what the steel is made of. So somebody in material culture would be great to have a look at. Don't damage my penknife, please, and don't cut yourself. However, I have found that when you're actually cutting quills, if you manage to cut yourself, the quill lasts for a lot longer, so it's like a little blood sacrifice. And so this thing set me off on a road to discovery, to think about how we don't look at something. So I came up with this theory of something I call angular confinement. So I believe that this script is actually made up of 3 straight lines. So we have 1, 2, and 3. And the line of universal beauty turns by a 6th up here and a 6th down here. So of course Hogarth talks about the line of beauty, which is quite an amazing line. And by using repetitive geometric principles and something I call tangential touching, you can construct the script inside this angular confinement. So that then led me to start thinking, well, what else is this angular confinement important for? If the line of universal beauty, which is the basic structural line for flourishing, is actually 3 straight lines, how does a flourish work? And so from starting in the 18th century, I'm now able to go back into the early modern period. Because of course, this is a line of universal beauty, as is this, and this, and that. So I then started to look at the structural integrity of the flourishing. And that led me to come up with some very interesting ideas. So flourishes are based on a number of things. First issue, so these are the basic rules. Like we have an alphabet, A, B, C, D, F, G, flourishing also has an alphabet. A is equal to 2 thin strokes can cross each other. A thick stroke and a thin stroke can cross each other, but 2 thick strokes should never cross each other because they create something called a hotspot. However, if you're using a pointed flexible tool, and let's get a brush up here. Two strokes of variable thickness can cross each other as long as the thickest parts don't cross each other in the same place. So this is an exception that I've had to come up with to cope with other people's explanation for flourishing that didn't quite work. So from here we then work on From here, we then look at other aspects of flourishing, like, it's okay. Other aspects of flourishing, like lines that need extensions. So we have a cross. And from that cross, we can create a figure of 8. And by appending a flourish, as in adding to the flourish, we can add lines that can augment the flourish. We can also add different types of appendages that do not connect all the way around. Now, it's this sort of language of flourishing that is really important, because once you can see the language, you can construct the flourish. A simple flourish is an extension on a letter. Now, there is a really beautiful R in that manuscript, the Van der Velde manuscript, which is this. And Sachiko said to me, can you give us an idea of what is simple, what is moderate, and what is we should not bother to try because we will look like fools? Now, there are some flourishes that I wouldn't even bother to try because technically the flourish is so complicated, but there is always an underlying simplistic framework from which to work. This is a smooth line. So from here, I started to work out how is a flourish constructed. We know that this equals this. Consequently, this equals that. And this is where I start to go a little bit crazy. Flourishes are based on geometry and physics. So a curve a series of curves are all based on centripetal force. When you have a car, how many of you drive? How many of you cycle? Oh, good, great. Cover everybody there. When you see a roundabout, or better still, when you see a curve, a turn in the road, and you can't actually see beyond the turn, you don't speed up to get to the turn. You slow down. You approach it cautiously, and of course, the tighter the turn, the slower you approach it, because you have no idea what's coming from the other side, unless you have a death wish. But as you approach the turn and you pass the apex of the turn, I found that there's something that I've called the variance of tolerance. So there is a 7 to 10 degree variance that exists in the script itself, in the way the letters are formed and sort of where the pen can be held in order to produce certain lines. And once you pass that 7 to 10 degree variance, you end up in something called the acceleration zone. Once you pass that acceleration zone, and those of you on a bike who love roundabouts, you get to that point and you just use it as a slingshot and go into the car. That acceleration zone is really important. So by approaching the curve on the flourish like you're driving, and it's very easy to apply this. In a car, you have the road, you have the tires, you have the weight of the car, and if it's a tall car, you have the height of the car, which is the center of gravity. And all of those things come together to affect centripetal force. Now, the road is the paper, or the vellum. The tines of the nib, as the nib spreads, are the two front wheels. The volume of ink is negligible. It's how hard you're pressing that gives you the weight of the car, weight on the tool. And how high you're holding the tool affects the center of gravity, equals centripetal force. On a much smaller scale, but when you're looking at a nib that can produce 80 hairline marks in a millimeter, it's almost the same thing as a car driving on the road. The only problem is, on a piece of paper, you see a curve and you speed up. So it seems sort of counterintuitive, but if you treat it like a car, you end up with the same principle. Now, this line I found to be one of the most important lines. This line and this shape. So most people say English roundhand is based on an oval. Well, if you think of an oval, the first thing that comes to mind is an egg. So if your shapes are based on an egg, they are not going to look good. So an ellipse, this flattened, this oblate ovoid shape, I found to be the most optimum shape for this script. By producing this, we have a horizontal axis, we have a a major axis with the center point here, and we have two semi-minor axes. Along that major axis, we have two focal points, and the two focal points actually exist at a sixth in from the end and the end. So the central bit is 2/3 long, which is a sixth of a turn and a sixth of a turn and 2/3 of a straight line. Now, I'm using English roundhand and the line of universal beauty as the basis for the flourishing structure, because when you move backward to the Van der Velde stuff and to the stuff from the Flemish writing masters and the Italian writing masters, so Cresci, Palatino, Tagliente, all these people used this underlying structure. I've only found 2 instances of the structure having a structural component. I've not seen many writing master copybooks where they've broken this down as a geometric structure. Now, I've been through a couple hundred of them, and I've only found a few of them. Recently found one in the Newbury Library, and I have a couple leads on some other bits and pieces. Of course, Albrecht Dürer did his just spacing of letters, but that was for Roman caps. Now, English roundhand is important. When I teach English roundhand script, I always tell students, if you don't know what a Roman capital letter looks like, you will never know how to balance an English roundhand letter. As is the same for cancelleresca. As is the same for all the scripts from the Roman period. So we have this quite important thing, and to prove that it works, we have this movement to create. Notice I slowed down on that. See, the major axis is the same major axis that we find on this letter, at this shape at 55 degrees, as is the same width. This crosses the focal point at a sixth. So I found that a sixth and a third runs through the entire substructure of the flourishes. Now that's really important to note, because the other thing that I've found is, apart from the angular confinement also fits. There are always two axes in the angular confinement. There's a horizontal axis and there's a 55-degree angle axis. And once you fit the thing in by doing some tangential touching, it will always work. It will always balance itself. Now, there is another shape that does this. And what I found is, by plotting the shape, you end up with a Fibonacci spiral. So the physics is there. The physics is there with the centripetal force. It's there in the mathematics. It sits inside of the flourish. So how do our other flourishes work? Well, based on this principle, a typical interlacing flourish exists based on, again, this geometric principle. So we can 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 11 and 12. I find counting really helps. So we have and 1, oh, let's use a different color. So we have and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. Right, now, it's just a warm-up. So it's all about something that I've had to come up with a few words. So I call this parallelism. This parallelism exists right throughout the flourishing structure. Now, flourishes also open from a starting point, like a Fibonacci spiral offset by itself. So with a Fibonacci spiral, so this is an arithmetic spiral, sorry about that. If you start at the starting point and you open at an increasing rate, you get the same distance. By decreasing the rate of increase, you end up with your basic underlying structure for a fractal flourish. Are we following? Okay, so I'll sit there and I'll do some demonstrations in a section, because it's seeing it up here is really important, because it gives you a framework within which to work. Now, this goes back into the middle of the medieval period. But of course, we also have other types of flourishing structure. For instance, we have something called a cadell. So this is a continuous so it's actually a little bit of a puzzle, and you have to keep counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You're spacing as you're going along. You can't plot the whole thing. I mean, obviously you can. It's quite easy to sort of plot the thing and go, yeah. So we'll put this here. That'll go there. This will go here, and that will go there. So we go 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5, and so by understanding, by not letting the lines confuse you, by not letting them make you think that you cannot do it, by looking for the simple central structure and building outward, the flourish becomes quite sort of apparent. Right, now for the problems. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work down here, and I'm going to take some aspects from this book, from the book you sent me. Actually, you know what? Let's start with this. Right. So we'll start with this. Here, we'll start with this, and we will look at this way. We'll look at the unicorn, and then we will look at the copy. So we'll look at those club serifs or ball serifs. But more importantly, or most importantly, we will look at that bottom flourish on that, what is that, with F, feigns. Now, one of the things about scribal practice is the scribe gets paid for the work they do. So as much as you want to theorize about what they're doing, the most important thing to put into the equation is money. What are you getting paid for? Because if you're not writing fast, you're not making money. And if you're not making money, then somebody else is making the money. And if you can't write quickly and small, you are wasting vellum and paper. So all of those things factor into why Humanist minuscule evolves into Cancellaresca cursiva, because the papal chanceries have a lot of writing going back and forth between them, and you cannot produce it with textualis. Now, I'm going to add one more thing to this before I sit down. Right. So all writing, every kind of writing is about rhythm. It's all rhythmic. Historically, if the writing generally reflects the high church music of the period. So if you think of copperplate script, right? I'll just put something very quickly here. Okay. So if you think, we need some minuscules. Right. So if you think of the script, right, you have because the nib has to open as well. So if you are looking at this script, in its heyday, the script, at its pinnacle, the script sort of falls right into some Handel music. And you can hear where you walk, cool gales shall fan the glade into a shade. And you can hear the script. You can really feel the script. Equally, if you think of textualis, you know, you have textualis and you have so every period, the script reflects the music of the period. And as soon as you slow the writing down, the script crystallizes. So you could technically infer what the intrinsic rhythmic value of the period is by looking at how the script is written. So for periods that we don't actually have written music for, we could probably infer, based on the instrument and the rhythm of the script, what the nature of the rhythm of the music of that period could be. So that is something for you guys to deal with, because I have a book to write on English roundhand. I'm happy to help, but okay, so let's get started here. So, right. So we're going to look at some really technical stuff, which can only really be done small. Okay. Right. So this is that manuscript that we were sent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick something, right? Let's start with this cancellaresca. So in writing master copybooks, this hand is generally referred to as something called an Italian hand. Let's just put this here for now. Now, I have these 3 videos. I'm making about 4 more. And the point of the video is to talk to students about the 3 P's, which is posture, placement, and position. Because if you're not sitting correctly, there is no way that you can produce smooth movements. One of the biggest problems with sitting improperly is as soon as you start slouching, you will lean on the arm that is writing. And if you're leaning on the writing arm, it can't really go anywhere. So let's look at this cancellaresca script, shall we? Let's take a quill. So I'll cut this quill traditionally. I'm a little bit irreverent with quills because people are a little bit too... Okay. So now I have a few theories for quill cutting myself. So my first theory is that this is a turkey feather. Is this turkey feather? This is a turkey feather. And some goose feathers, which are, you know, quite big as well, they have a... Great, that's great. They have a minor axis and they have a major axis. Now, years and years and years ago, when I moved to this country, David Gantz once asked me, how did they write uncial script that big? He said, I'm just going to leave you with that. So, you know, I know you could figure this out. Get back to me when you have a chance. I hated David for that because I didn't sleep for weeks. Now, I looked at this quill. We were always taught that a quill has to sit like this. So this is what you do. You put the quill in the hand and you wait for it to find some stability. And once it's stable, you know that that's your nib. that's the nib. That's the nib there. So you would flip the quill over, turn it around, do an incision. Once you've done the incision, you can write. Okay, so let's save this one for a little bit, because that's actually a really nice one to demonstrate my own theory. So there we go. It's settled. We flip it. We turn it. We make an incision. Get the pith out. I've had these for about 10 years, so they've cured naturally. Once you've made the incision, you have two options. You can either put the knife in, push up, and it'll crack naturally. So I'll stay with it. It's okay. I'll manage this. You put the knife in, you push up, and you'll hear packs. I prefer to cut my quill first, because you know what? We have precision materials. We don't have big, fat, blunt quill knives, which you can get if you want. But an X-Acto blade, if you want a new one, if you want a clean, sharp X-Acto blade, you just go into the box. So by pushing down and out, we end up with a scooped cut, right? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another scoop on the shoulders, and then I'm going to, let's see if I can get that. I'm going to pair that nib at the front there. I'm going to turn that into the nib, which means you are on the minor axis, which means you cannot make a big quill, because the minor axis is a really tight turn. Now, I'm a little bit crazy, so I see patterns in patterns, as Alice will tell you, which drives her crazy, because she'll be writing, and I'll be like, oh my gosh, Alice, listen. So my understanding of this ellipse started to filter through. So you cut down. No, great, that's great. So if we see here, so let me just come back, because it's quite, you can see how that quill, I've just cut that bit there. Now, look at, there we go. Do you see that meniscus shape, that curved shape? Well, if you try to write with that, only those 2 points will touch the page. So the nib cannot be that wide. So you have to then pare that down more and more and more and more and more. I'm going to try and be nice to this quill, because I want to use it for a couple of things. All right, so we have that. We have a nice little nib there. And then I put the cut in. So I'm just going to put a little slit in. And then you cut down. Now, these Western calligraphy quills are very different to Arabic calligraphy quills. They're cut in a different way, where you have to press on the quill and then do the cut down. And what it does is it gives you a straight shape with a notch in the middle and a little lift on the end. So when you're doing the Torah script, you press the quill and the nib spreads open and gives the curve at the top as well as the bottom. It's really fascinating how different cultures use different tools. Right. My theory for quill cutting is different, because I cannot see the point in wasting a perfectly good quill. So I would always look for which is the flatter axis. Okay, so that's it. So this side is flatter than that. I would do the cut here, and then I would scoop the pith out, or just push it down there. And then I would scoop that out, and then I would pare this back, And what that would do is it will give me a really nice fat quill. And so what I now end up with is something which is a lot bigger than you can get from using the minor axis. So that's my own little theory that I've been working on. Because, you know what? Nothing man-made can write as well as a quill can. So when we have big work to do, if we run into a problem, you still want a quill. So that's a massive difference. So the small quill is actually half of the big quill. Now there are other ways to do it. You can do something called dutching, which is flattening the quill with a heated iron, and it really gives you a really where the one of the major axes is, it gives you a flat top. Problem is, if the iron's too hot, you blister the quill, it damages the writing, so you have to really know what you're doing. Now there are some modern conventions of preparing them. You soak them in salty water, you leave them overnight, they dry the quill out. You could even soak them in water and zap them in the microwave for 2 seconds. You know, it just goes beep, ding. Because if you put it in for any longer, the quill blisters and explodes in the microwave, and it is the nastiest smell. It is even worse than making parchment. And it stays in the kitchen. And then you really don't even want to eat anymore. It's just like, oh God, I can't even bear to be in this kitchen. Right. Sheet of glass, little piece of glass, always helpful, because you do need something hard to cut the quill against. And you know, I find all of this fascinating because where did you find this in a Scribal studio? Where was this hard surface? Because you can't do it on wood. Because if you're pressing down on the surface and it's on a piece of wood, well, it's too soft, and so the quill isn't going to get a sharp cut. So what did they cut this against? They must have had a little piece of metal. Sorry? Yeah, but the problem with a book, but have you found scratches on book clasps? Because you know, a book clasp is really expensive. But you know, you can't even do it on a piece of brass, because the brass is really soft. So all these little things that have to happen before you start the writing that, you know, that we haven't really considered. I always walk with a piece of glass, because sometimes I have tried to use a clasp, but there's a curve. And so the nib never quite gets onto it, and it slips and you mess it up, you have to recut it. So, you know, what did they use? Where was that thing? Of course, you know, you always end up with all of that junk. So this is, I'm bending the page because I'm doing something. I give the page a little bit of lift. So one of the amazing things about Vellum is it's a nightmare to work on. And because it's a nightmare to work on, and it is so responsive to the atmosphere, it will invariably not be flat, which is a good thing. Because in order to write lightly and delicately, you want the page to help you. You want the writing implement to help you as well. So by allowing the nib to come up to the page, you do a little less work. Where have you gone? You do a little less work, and the page and the nib do some of the work. So I always cut this off at the back because you don't really want the sticking in your eye when you're trying to work. You go to the theatre and they show you this crazy thing with all these big feathers on the back, and you're like, oh! Right. Of course, this also comes up. This also shows something really interesting as well. When we were at school, our art teacher said to us, "Get a little jar, little jar, and at the end of every month, just take a hairpin and scoop the earwax out of your ear and keep it in the jar." And we're like, "What?" So we're like, "What is this about?" Then when we came to gilding, we laid our first batch of gesso and tried to gild it, and it looked like, it looked polka dot, because the gesso had air bubbles which effervesced afterwards. So we're like, "Oh, this didn't gild nicely." He said, "Go to the jar, take a pin prick of earwax and drop it into the gesso." The gesso effervesced like nothing. Every air bubble disappeared. And then we started to think, how did they figure that out? Well, you could see how they figured that out. They'd be like, So there are all these things that, we sort of put these amazing theories to, and then you actually find that the theories are really actually a lot simpler than that. So I'm going to start off with this Cancellaresca Corsiva movement. I discovered this movement because I didn't think, funnily enough, I didn't think Crasshi's structure for this thing was real. And this also comes out of the fact that writing masters lie. And they lie because they don't want anybody to write as fast as them. There is no way you would make a ball serif like that if you are writing quickly. It's a waste of time. So you have a lead-in stroke, right? Okay, so you might need to get really close for this. Okay, so let's put this here. So you have a lead-in stroke. Right? With the lead-in stroke, and of course Cancellaresca Corsiva is at a slight angle, we would get and here is the ball serif, and up and over and down, 1, 2, 3. That's your ball. You also have a flourish version of it, which is and 1 and 2 and 3. I'm going to lift this up. I can't lift it too much because there you go. Of course, with Palatino, you have two things to consider. How short were the tines? So with Palatino, we have and then you have that uprightness. Now, these tines are a little bit on the long side. I think Palatino's tines were a little bit shorter than mine. Crasshi's tines might have been longer, but that's also to accommodate the use of a left oblique cut quill. So let's drop that in. So I'm just going to cut this quill with a left oblique cut. And I will show you something completely different. And let's cut that. And of course, the other thing that made me start looking into these left oblique cuts was what David Gantz had asked me. Because not only can you increase the surface area at the front of the nib by using the the major axis, you can also increase its surface area by adding a left oblique to the cut. The thing about a left oblique cut is it's a very telling shape. If you use a left oblique cut, this is where the thickest part of the nib will, the thickest part of the deposition will be, at the bottom on the turn, not halfway down the letter. So when you see letters where the deposition of ink is heavier at the turning point, notice it's heavy here, but the movement from a thinner shape to a wider shape is much more dramatic than it is here. So that gives that's a fairly telling sign. That's why when I looked at that, I could see exactly what it was. That also then allowed us to do this shape. So Bickham, in The Accomplished Clerk, said, come down on the flat of the nib, and as you get to the bottom, go up onto the top right-hand corner. Let's do it bigger. On to the point, and that is your letter there. Now, the amazing thing about this shape is this. This is why I make a distinction between English roundhand and Proto-English roundhand. If you look at early writing master samples of their writing, not of the copybook, you will see that this squared off shape, which when done with a pointed flexible nib, is, I should have done this before, sorry about that. So if we look at these two together, we can see that here the top is flat. It's horizontal to the baseline. Here the top is at an angle. And that is a telling shape that the nib is not straight cut. There is an oblique on that cut. Whereas on this, we don't see that. But on this we do. But look at... If we look at there, where the turn is, that moves over onto the top right tine, which is higher than the than a normal nib, because a normal nib, the two tines are the same height. So why is that important? Well, that eventually gives us the ability to do this. Now, other thing, I'm very conscious of inferring what would have happened based on sort of what we know. In America, the Americans use this shape, this thing, actually, I need to leave that on. They use this muscle to bounce on. So the muscle is here. And by bouncing on that muscle, it allows you to produce smooth curves. That allows American Spencerian script. And that gives us some really super beautiful, fine hairlines. There are no shakes. Oh, see, no shakes. No shaking in the script. Well, if there's no shaking in the script, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because when you said that, I nearly fell out of my chair. The Americans believe that their Spencerian script is brand new, and that Platt Roger Spencer invented it. I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for saying this. But I don't think so, because I taught myself subtle inschrift. And when you look at this shape, and you look at this shape, well, I'm sorry, but they are just too similar to each other. It's not just that. There are lots of other shapes in their writing system that look like this German script. And the way in which the letters are formed, obviously you have the lowercase a, which is, and you have. Now, I did think, well, maybe it's some convergent evolution, but it's too similar. And then I started to think about, was there a whole arm movement? Well, you cannot do this without a whole arm movement. You cannot do these without whole arm movement. And so by resting the arm on the table, that does not mean you're leaning on the arm. The arm is supported. And by it being supported, you have the ability to do this. Notice my shoulder isn't like this. I'm not lifting the shoulder. I'm not pushing the shoulder back. The shoulder is sitting on the desk. The arm is sitting on the desk. And the whole hand is moving freely. So we've looked at how this cancelleresca corsiva / Italian script, which is a later form of the cancelleresca corsiva, exists. So I'm going to look at some slightly more complex aspects to this. How much time do we have left?
About 15 minutes.
Okay. Okay, so I'll do 2 or 3 more things, and then I'll open it up to questions. An engraver will only produce what is given to them. Okay, that's all I need to say. Bye. An engraver will not augment a script from a scribe. Because if you know scribes, and a scribe gives somebody something and they change it, they will bite their heads off. A scribe is an artisan of the highest quality. They will not give a script to someone that they've done to strike into copper and allow them to change it so dramatically that the script that the engraver produces then becomes known as the name of the script produced by the writing master. So the use of the word copperplate to describe English roundhand is erroneous, because the script existed prior to that. Of course, there is this Proto-English roundhand, which is constructed by using a small left oblique cut quill, tilting onto the edge until, well, by a simple exercise of problem, I am not going to left oblique cut something all the time when I can produce the same shape with a pointed nib. Because the tool, well, even if you're cutting a quill, if you pare a quill down, it's much easier to pare down to a point than it is to pare down to a straight edge. So by finding what the easiest, and it's like water, you put water on a floor, it will find its easiest path to get out. By finding the easiest way to cut the tool, that then influenced the direction the script moved in. Of course, technology is the most important thing. Sumerians wrote in clay because that's what they had. If we have a pointed tool, if we're moving from a left oblique cut tool which has a point, what is the point in cutting a square edge and putting a point on it when you could just cut a point? Now, so I'm going to look at that based on this shape, which again turned up in one of the signatures, which was this. Right. That is a and you will see this kind of shape happening, and that, so these two in there, that only happens when the quill spreads. Well, The other thing to note, to look for, isn't just that, but it's something a little bit more subtle, and it is that. That roughness is one edge trailing behind the other on a quill. And if you have a pointed flexible quill, so let's just sacrifice a quill. Who would like to die? I talk to my tools, sorry. You know, I always talk to my tools. You know, I worked on my own for a long time. When you worked on your own for such a long time, you'd come and you'd be like, hi, okay, who's going to suffer today? Okay, so here we go. So how many of you have seen a quill cutter? Okay, so right, let's get this up here. So this is a quill cutter, which is ostensibly based on the same principle as a cigar cutter. So you have your penknife, which is super sharp, so I'm not going to take it out because I'll cut myself. Lots of little rivets, some ivory, which made for a bit of a problem to get out of the country. Stupid me. And then you have this mechanism, which raises up. So you can see inside there. Hello. And then you have this mechanism. Now, I didn't realize how amazing this quill cutter was until recently. This quill cutter, when this depresses, it cuts the nib at a point on the inside. But this quill cutter has a little ridge down the middle of that triangular section, which actually slits the nib too. And the quill cutters, I've never seen another one like this. I was really lucky to get this. The guy actually gave it to me because I was going to use it and not put it in the collection. Oh, he didn't give it to me, I bought it, but you know, he gave it to me at a very good price. So it cuts down, and that's what you get. Oh, where is it? That's what you get. So you see the point at the top and the bit at the bottom. I'm just going to cut out, not using the penknife because it's really way too sharp. So just pare that away. Oh, brilliant. Oh, right. And then let's put it in front of my... That's what you get. A nice, sharp point with an ink channel in the middle. Now, the only problem with this is the tines are quite long. Well, if the tines are that long, what you're going to end up with is that. Now, if the tines are shorter, you end up with something very different. Some of the flourishes in this manuscript, in this writing master copybook, can only be done with a very, 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 very small tool, because the smaller the barrel, the more support the nib has to produce a hairline. And that's where I didn't have time to do this, but fortunately I could beg the Crown Office to let me have access to the ravens. Because you're not allowed to pick up raven feathers at the tower, because they're used for black magic. But I could ask the Crown Office to get some, because I have written with crow's quills, and the nib is so fine and so hard that you can get these extra super fine hairlines that you see in manuscripts and think, okay, that is not possible. There must be a time traveler here. So, so by looking at the material culture, what did they have? I mean, we were talking earlier on about they used what they had. Well, what was small and fine enough and hard enough to produce such a beautiful hairline? By making the nib shorter, let's cut this down and a little bit more. Let's clean this off. you have a lot less give and you can flourish with the corner of the quill. Because a quill, unlike any other tool, I mean, we do have tools you can do that with. Because it's organic, it will pull the ink. Let's get the tool. Okay, the flourishes actually look thicker on the screen than they actually are. So, that is your fault. My flourishes are much finer than that. So this brings us to and thank you so much for inviting me. And it's been an absolute joy to look through this. So I started to look at this and I thought, okay, why would they do what they've done? Well, you only get these meniscus-like shapes, these curved shapes at the bottoms of letters if you use a quill. Nothing else will produce that. Only a quill will produce a curve at the bottom of a letter. You can get some man-made instruments to do it, but let's just put that up. You can get some man-made instruments to do it, but invariably that's probably a little bit more stable. But invariably, so we're looking at the title stuff. So if we just look at the edges, the bottoms of those, you can see those curves. That's clearly exaggerated by a Burin. But it must have come from somewhere. It didn't magically get there because they had nothing else to do. It got there because it was part of the original illustration. And that happens when a quill is used. So this is a quill. Now, some of the Joseph Champion stuff that I saw at the Newbury was really fine, but you could see the movement of the quill on the paper because of the roughness of the edges. So it wasn't a brush, because a brush would not produce an edge like that. A brush would produce a different edge because, of course, the paper was slightly sort of softer and a little bit fluffier. But a brush would never, ever produce an edge like that. Only a quill dragging along paper would produce roughness on an edge. But also, only a quill that was left oblique cut would give you some of those shapes. The problem with this particular manuscript is it's a copybook. So it was cut in copper. So what's here is not exactly what Van der Velde gave the engrave, what he gave Gethering to engrave. So you have to sort of take this with a pinch of salt and kind of retrofit what the writing master was doing. Now, I'm going to do something that I'm not sure if I'm going to make a fool of myself. But I used to do these quite a lot. And then I stopped doing them because people used to get annoyed with me when I did them. And you will see why. I'll probably get annoyed with myself trying to do them. So I will do this, and then we'll open up the floor for any questions. Right. Ah, okay, I'll use this. Oh, no, I'll use this. One thing before I start, let's use this. You also have different tools. So this is a music ruling pen, which you could make when it's working. Five lines width. But equally, you can so, it's a lot easier than you think. The one thing calligraphers, scribes were known for was ingenuity. Because it's all about writing faster, making more money. Because you write slow, you don't get the money. Right, okay. Let's see if I can remember how to do this. Right. we'll use the big quill just to prove to you that it works. Right. So ingenuity is also based on tools. You would never really try to make this shape this way because you'll run out of ink. Because the deposition of weight needs to be here. So you would turn the tool, turn the page around and do and then you could turn it back. Because what you want to do then is you want to go and 1 and 2, right. And that's a heart attack. So you end up with this thing called a pointed nib Cadell flourish. So I've flourished through the shape. Let me just do this again. Let's get a nicer shape, shall we? Now, I do have notes for this kind of thing where I've done it in the past and I've made notes to figure out how it would have been done. But of course, the amazing thing about this kind of work is we're always told to pin the page down. Well, if you pin the page down, there's only one thing that can move then, and that's you. So you have to get up and stand around the page and move the thing around. But where was the page held? And that's something that really interests me. Because historically, heart. Let's get a little bit closer. Here we go. Now, I never actually get to finish much study because I'm always busy dealing with clients, which is changing, thankfully. So one of the things I've started to do is I've started to revisit the stuff that I started when I didn't have that many clients. I'm actually stepping back from the business so that I can actually do some research now, because I've realized that this is the thing that I love. And it's stuff like this that I find fascinating. So when I was in art school, I started questioning things. And David Gantz was great, and he really sort of helped me to sort of think differently. And so he kept saying, well, why don't you think about this? Why don't you think about that? And he said to me, why don't you look at how scribes actually worked? Because we theorize about it, which is great. But you can see if the theories are right. Because if you try to write what we say will work and it doesn't work, then something's wrong. So, he sort of said, why don't you just look at stuff? So I started doing two different kinds of looking. One was looking and not reading what other people say, actually looking at the script. I know tools well enough to figure out what's going on. I can figure out the doctors quite easily. And then I started looking at illustrations in manuscripts of scribes. Now, a goose quill will give you an elliptical cross-section. An ellipse has four axes, two major axes and two minor axes. A swan feather has a circular cross-section. Now, a circle can quite easily accommodate a triangle and be stable. But an ellipse can't really accommodate a triangle and be stable. It can only really accommodate a square or a four-sided figure, which means the hold of the tool must be proportional to the cross-section of the tool. Well, if an ellipse has four axes, two major and two semi-major and two semi-minor axes, then surely a triangular pen hold will not work because one of the axes is unstable. So I started looking at the manuscripts, and illustrations of the manuscripts are monks holding their tools like this. But of course, they're in front of it. It's over there. They're writing over there, so they could see what they're doing. They're not looking like this. People sit like this on the right. But the board starts to change. So from the Middle Ages, you have a sort of 45-degree angle board, and the board starts to get flatter. But the hold doesn't change. By the time you get to the English roundhand period, the nib, now I've not actually seen this as an illustration, but why is English roundhand at 55 degrees? If something is at 30 degrees, it's fine. If it's at 45 degrees, it's fine. If it's 60 degrees, it's fine. But 55 degrees is a really arbitrary angle. How do you come up with 55 degrees? So then I came up with this recently. I came up with this idea of something called the variance of tolerance. So you have a variable movement of, this variance of 7 to 10 degrees of how you hold the pen across the axis of the script. But this was still a problem, because this and a flattening board eventually gives you this, which is 55 degrees. And that also led me to start thinking, well, if that's at 55 degrees, and the Americans think that they came up with this, this muscular movement thing, I was like, this is just madness, because the script is actually a lie, because it came up, it's obviously through something else. But, Americans don't like people to know that Germans help them with anything, so, we're just going to leave that there. But by dropping the arm onto the desk and looking at the large charters and deeds, if you look at the shape of the movement, the script on those documents in the sort of 18th century, 19th century, early 20th century, they're not like if we pull them with a pointed flexible nib. It's like we've pushed them and pulled them, which is different, because it's not a pull-push script, because if it's a pull-push script, the pull is more sort of, it feels different, it has a different vibration. But the push script is the pointed bit, so that sits on this. So muscular movement did actually exist. Anyway, okay.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.